The morning Reuben Bristol rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, he carried two things with him: a folded land deed tucked against his chest, and a loneliness so deep it had settled into his bones like the cold of a hard winter that refused to let go. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown eyes that had seen more of the plains than most men his age cared to admit. He had worked cattle drives from Texas to Missouri, slept under more stars than under roofs, and saved every dollar he had earned for nearly a decade with one singular purpose in mind. That purpose had a name, and that name was the Harlan Creek property, 40 acres of the finest grazing land south of Caldwell, with a creek that ran clear even in the dry months, and a natural tree line that broke the wind just right. He had purchased it fair and square from old Harlan Pritchard himself before the man passed on, paid in full, and had the deed signed and witnessed to prove it. He had not been in any particular hurry to come back and claim it, having spent the last year finishing up a cattle contract in Texas. But now he was here, and the land was waiting, and he was ready to plant something permanent for the first time in his life. What he was not ready for was Emma Harper. He found out about her before he even made it to the land itself. He had stopped at the general store on the edge of town to pick up a few supplies, and the storekeeper, a wiry man named Garfield with a gray mustache and the habit of talking in circles, mentioned the situation as casually as he might mention the weather. "You heading south of town?" Garfield asked, wrapping a block of salt in paper. "Harlan Creek property," Reuben said. "I own it." Garfield paused and looked up over his glasses. "Well now," he said slowly, "that's something you might want to talk to the county register about before you go making any declarations." Reuben set his money on the counter. "What does that mean?" "Means there's been a woman living out there since December. Emma Harper. She came down from Missouri with her daughter after her husband passed. She filed papers with the county saying the land had been abandoned, and she was making a homestead claim under the Homestead Act." Garfield slid the wrapped goods across the counter and watched Reuben with the cautious expression of a man who had seen disputes turn ugly before. "The county hasn't ruled on it yet. Got a hearing set for next Friday." Reuben stood very still for a moment, his jaw tight. Then he picked up his supplies, thanked the man with a short nod, and walked back out into the spring sunlight. He told himself he would ride out there, introduce himself calmly, show her the deed, and let the legal process sort itself out. He was a reasonable man. He had always been a reasonable man. He rode south along the creek road with that reasonable intention firmly in his mind, and it held right up until the moment he crested the small rise above the property and looked down at what had become of his 40 acres since December. Someone had been working this land hard. The old Pritchard cabin, which had been half collapsed when he last saw it, had been repaired, new boards cut and fitted along the west wall, the roof patched with fresh shingles, the porch cleared of rot and reinforced with timber. A small kitchen garden had been broken and planted along the south side of the cabin. A linta had been built against the old fence line for 2 horses that stood quietly in the afternoon light. Laundry hung on a line strung between 2 cottonwood trees, snapping in the Kansas breeze. There were flower seedlings in a clay pot beside the front step. Someone had even replaced the broken gate post at the entrance to the property. This was not the work of someone squatting. This was the work of someone who intended to stay, someone who had looked at a broken-down piece of land and decided to build a life on it. He was still taking it all in when the front door of the cabin opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch with a rifle resting in the crook of her arm. She was not pointing it at him, but she was holding it in a way that made very clear she knew how to use it and would not hesitate to do so if the occasion called for it. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark auburn hair pulled back under a worn hat, and she wore a plain work dress and boots that had seen considerable mud. Her face was angular and composed, with green eyes that looked at him across the distance between them with the particular sharpness of someone who had learned to size up strangers quickly and make accurate judgments. "You're on private property," she called out. Her voice carried clearly across the spring air. Reuben held up one hand to show it was empty and kept his other hand easy and visible on the saddle horn. "Ma'am," he said, nudging his horse forward at a slow walk. "My name is Reuben Bristol. I believe we need to have a conversation." She did not move from the porch. "That's so. It is." He stopped a respectful distance from the gate and looked at her steadily. "I have a deed to this property signed by Harlan Pritchard and witnessed by two men whose names are on record at the county. I purchased this land 2 years ago." He watched her jaw tight. He watched something pass through her eyes that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but something more complicated than either, something that looked very much like the expression of a person who has built something precious and is being told it might be taken away. "I filed a homestead claim," she said. "I know you did." "I heard. The land was sitting empty. The cabin was half rotted. No one had been working it." "I was finishing a cattle contract in Texas," Reuben said. "I planned to come back." "I always planned to come back." There was a pause. A meadowlark called somewhere in the distance. Emma Harper looked at him with those sharp green eyes and then looked down at the porch for a moment, and when she looked back up there was something exhausted in her expression, something that she was clearly fighting to keep from showing. "My daughter is inside," she said, very quietly. "She is 4 years old. My husband died of fever last October. I had enough money to get us here and not much else. I spent the winter fixing this place up because it was the only option I could see." Reuben did not say anything for a long moment. He looked at the repaired cabin, at the garden, at the laundry on the line. He looked at the flower seedlings on the porch step. "When is the county hearing?" he asked. "Friday," she said. "I know," he said. "I was already told." He looked back at her. "I won't trouble you today, Mrs. Harper. I'll see you at the hearing." He turned his horse and rode back up the rise without another word. He found a room at the boarding house in Caldwell, run by a woman named Mrs. Dunlevy, who fed her boarders enormous dinners and asked very few questions, which suited Reuben's current state of mind exactly. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed that night with the deed unfolded on his knee, reading the words he already knew by heart, and he tried to think clearly about the situation. The law was on his side. The deed was signed and dated more than 2 years ago. A homestead claim could not override a prior legal purchase. When he went before County Register Harmon Peck on Friday, it would be a short hearing. He would show the deed, the county would deny Mrs. Harper's claim, and the land would be confirmed as his. That was how it would go. He was certain of it. He was also certain of the way her voice had sounded when she said, "My daughter is inside," the particular flatness of it, the way a person speaks when they are trying to say something without letting themselves feel it too completely. He folded the deed back up and put it away and lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. Over the next several days leading up to Friday, Reuben occupied himself with practical matters. He visited the land office to speak with a man named Deputy Register Collins, who confirmed that yes, his prior deed superseded any homestead filing. He spoke with the county judge briefly in passing, a weathered old man named Judge Aldridge, who told him the hearing was straightforward and not to worry. He bought lumber and made a list of everything the Harlan Creek property would need to become a proper working ranch. He sat in the evenings at the boarding house writing out plans and figures in a small ledger. He did not ride back out to the property. He told himself there was no reason to. On the third day, a Wednesday, he was coming out of the feed store when he nearly walked directly into Emma Harper, who was coming around the corner with a small girl holding her hand and a list in her other hand. The little girl had her mother's auburn hair and was wearing a blue dress that had been carefully mended at the hem. They both stopped. The girl looked up at Reuben with large, solemn brown eyes. "Mr. Bristol," Emma said, and her chin lifted slightly in the particular way of someone bracing for something unpleasant. "Mrs. Harper," he said, and he took off his hat because his mother had raised him right regardless of circumstances. He looked at the little girl. "Who is this?" Emma hesitated, as though she was deciding whether engaging with him was wise or not. Then the little girl spoke for herself. "Lily," she said, with great seriousness. "My name is Lily Ann Harper, and I am 4 3/4." "Lily," Reuben said, and he smiled despite himself. "That is a fine name." Lily studied him for a moment. "Your hat is big," she announced. "Lily," Emma said quietly. "It is big," Reuben agreed. "It keeps the sun off." He straightened up and looked at Emma. She was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "How are you managing?" he asked, and he genuinely was not sure why he asked it. "We are managing fine," she said. "Good," he said. There was a pause. Lily had begun examining a crack in the boardwalk with great scientific interest. "Mr. Bristol," Emma said, and her voice was steady and controlled, but he could hear something underneath it working hard. "I want you to know that I understand the situation. I'm not a foolish woman. I know what you have and what you can prove." She looked directly at him. "I also want you to know that I have written to the county on the matter of improvements. Whatever the outcome of Friday, I put considerable labor and money into that property, and I intend to be heard on that point." "You should be heard on that point," Reuben said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. You repaired that cabin considerably. You broke ground on a garden. You put real work into it." He turned his hat in his hands. "That's worth something, and you should say so." She looked at him the way a person looks at something unexpected, with a kind of careful attention, as though recalculating. "I will," she said at last. They parted ways on the boardwalk, and Reuben walked 3 blocks before he realized he was still holding his hat in his hands and had forgotten to put it back on. Friday arrived with a clear blue sky and a strong south wind that carried the smell of blossoming cottonwoods across Caldwell. The county register's office was a small building next to the courthouse, and by the time Reuben arrived at 9 in the morning, there were already several people gathered outside. The way things tend to gather in a small town when there is a dispute to be witnessed and talked about afterward. Inside, the room held a long table where Register Harmon Peck sat with his record books and wire-rimmed glasses. He was a thin, precise man with a reputation for fairness and for making decisions that would hold up to scrutiny because he was thorough about the details. He had laid out both filings on the table in front of him and was reviewing them when Emma Harper came in through the door, Lily left in the care of a neighboring woman outside. She was wearing her best dress. Reuben could see that. It was a clean, dark blue wool, pressed carefully, with her hair pinned up neatly. She sat down on one side of the table and Reuben sat on the other, and Harmon Peck looked at both of them over his glasses. "I have reviewed the documentation," Peck said without preamble. "Mr. Bristol, your deed of purchase from Harlan Pritchard is dated March 14, 1880, is signed by Pritchard in his own hand, and is witnessed by 2 men both still living and willing to affirm it. Mrs. Harper, your homestead filing was submitted December 8, 1881, citing the property as apparently abandoned under the conditions established by the Homestead Act of 1862. He set down the papers and looked at her. "The difficulty, Mrs. Harper, is that the Homestead Act provides for claims on public land or land that has reverted to public ownership. A privately purchased property, regardless of whether it appears occupied, does not qualify for homestead filing." Emma's hands were folded on the table in front of her, very still. "I understand that," she said quietly. "I am therefore bound to confirm that Mr. Bristol's prior purchase deed is the governing document in this matter, and that the Harlan Creek property is his by lawful right." Peck paused and looked over at Reuben. "Now, I will add, as a matter for the record, that Mrs. Harper has documented improvements to the property valued at approximately $40 in materials, not counting her labor. Mr. Bristol, the law does allow for compensation of improvements in such cases, though the exact terms would need to be negotiated privately." He looked at Reuben and he looked at Emma, and he folded his hands and waited. Emma was looking at the table. Not defeated exactly, but very still in the way that comes just before someone decides what to do next, the deep stillness before a decision. Reuben had sat through that entire hearing knowing exactly how it would end. He had known it before he walked in. He had the deed folded in his breast pocket and had not even needed to produce it because Peck had the record copy. He had sat there and watched Emma Harper listen to the decision with that very still face and those hands folded on the table, and something in him had been moving all week, something slow and tectonic, and it arrived fully formed in that moment as Peck finished speaking. He looked at Emma. He looked at the way she was sitting, straight-backed, quiet, accepting something painful with a kind of dignity that had cost her something to maintain. He thought about Lily outside in the blue dress asking about his hat. He thought about the flower seedlings in the clay pot on the porch step. "Mr. Bristol," Peck said, "is there anything you wish to state for the record?" Reuben sat with it for a breath. Then another. Then he set both hands flat on the table and looked at Harmon Peck. "I'd like to propose a settlement," he said. Emma looked up sharply. "What settlement?" Peck asked. "The property is mine by deed," Reuben said. "That's established. But I want to propose that the county record a formal agreement between myself and Mrs. Harper, in which I deed her the full 40 acres of the Harlan Creek property, free and clear, effective immediately." The silence in the room was profound. Peck stared at him. Somewhere behind him, he heard one of the observers at the back of the room make a small sound of surprise. Emma Harper had gone completely motionless. "Mr. Bristol," Peck said carefully, "you understand what you are proposing." "I do," Reuben said. "You are proposing to surrender clear title to a 40-acre property with water access that you purchased and paid for." "I am. May I ask why?" Reuben paused and thought about it honestly. "Because she earned it," he said at last. "She came to a broken-down place in the middle of a Kansas winter with a small child and fixed it up and worked it and made something of it. Because the law says it's mine, but the plain, honest truth of the matter is that she's done more for that land in 4 months than I had done in 2 years of owning it on paper." He looked at Emma then, directly, and she was looking back at him with an expression he had no word for. "I'll find other land," he said. "There's plenty of it. She needs this particular piece." The room was very quiet. "That is your right to do," Peck said slowly. "And I will record it as you say. Mrs. Harper, do you accept?" Emma opened her mouth and then closed it again. She pressed her lips together for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was very even and very careful, and Reuben understood that she was holding something back that was too large for that room. "Yes," she said, "I accept." Harmon Peck drew up the paperwork with his characteristic thoroughness, and within the hour it was signed and witnessed and recorded, and Emma Harper was the legal owner of the Harlan Creek property, 40 acres with creek access, free and clear, because Reuben Bristol had told the county register that she had earned it. When they came out of the office into the spring sunshine, Lily came running across the street from the neighbor woman and threw herself at Emma's legs, and Emma caught her and held her close and pressed her face into the child's hair, and Reuben stood a few feet away putting his hat back on and looking out at the street as though the view required his full attention. "Mr. Bristol," Emma said. He turned back. She was standing with Lily on her hip, and whatever she had been holding back in the register's office was right there in her eyes now, undisguised. "Why?" she asked simply. "I told you why," he said. "You told the register why," she said. "You told it to the room, but I'm asking you." He was quiet for a moment. The south wind moved through the cottonwoods along the street. "Because watching you accept that decision in there," he said slowly, "was the hardest thing I've sat through in a good while, and I did not particularly want to be the cause of it." She looked at him for a long time. "You are not what I expected," she said. "No," he said, and almost smiled. "Neither are you." He tipped his hat to Lily, who waved at him with great enthusiasm, and he walked back toward the boarding house, and he did not think about whether he had made the right decision because there had never been any doubt in him about it. Not for a single moment. What he did think about, more than he intended to, was Emma Harper's green eyes in the sunlight outside the register's office. He found another parcel of land south of Caldwell within 2 weeks, 60 acres this time, a little rougher than Harlan Creek but with good bones and potential. It was farther from town and would need more work, but it was his, and the price was right, and he bought it and began making plans. He hired a man named Willis Cord to help him build a proper cabin and a barn, and they worked steadily through May and into early June, cutting timber, hauling stone for the foundation, raising walls against the Kansas sky. The work was good and it absorbed him, but Caldwell was not a large town, and he found himself seeing Emma Harper with some regularity. At the general store, where she was buying feed for her chickens, she had acquired 4 chickens from a neighbor and was expanding the kitchen garden south. At the post office on a Tuesday morning, where she was sending a letter back to Missouri. At the church on Sunday, which he had started attending with some regularity for reasons he was not entirely honest with himself about. She was unfailingly polite to him. She asked how the new property was coming along. She thanked him again, once formally, and he told her to please not thank him any more, and she nodded, and they left it there. Lily had no such reservations and would call out to him across the street with complete abandon whenever she spotted him, which he found he looked forward to in a way he did not entirely examine. One morning in late May, he was at the feed store loading sacks onto his wagon when Emma Harper arrived with a broken wheel. Spoke that she was trying to get the liveryman next door to look at. The liveryman was busy and brusque and told her it would be 3 days. She thanked him quietly and went back to her wagon and stood looking at the spoke with the expression of someone doing rapid calculations about how bad the inconvenience was going to be. Reuben tied off his last sack and walked over. "I can fix that," he said. She looked at him. "Mr. Bristol, it's a simple repair. I have the tools. I can have it done in an hour." There was a brief pause in which she clearly weighed the offer against something, pride perhaps, or the discomfort of accepting another thing from him. He watched her make the decision. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They worked side by side for the better part of an hour, him doing the work and her holding things, and handing him tools with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who knew how to be useful in a practical situation. Lily sat on the wagon bench and supervised, offering periodic commentary that was largely about a lizard she had seen near the wheel. "You handle yourself well," he said at some point, fitting the new spoke into place. "Out here, I mean. You said you came from Missouri." "I grew up on a farm," she said, handing him the mallet. "My father was a farmer. I know how to work." "It shows," he said. "That cabin looked solid when I saw what you'd done to it." She was quiet for a moment. "My husband was a good man," she said, and her tone was careful, as though she was speaking something she had thought about how to say. "He was a school teacher. We had a good life. When he died, I had to think very hard and very fast about what came next, because there was not a great deal of time for grieving when there was a child to provide for." She paused. "I heard about the Harlan Creek property from a woman in Abilene who had heard about it from someone else. It seemed like the only option that had real ground under it." "I'm glad you found it," Reuben said, and meant it completely. She looked at him sideways. "You're glad I found the land you paid for." "I'm glad you had somewhere solid to land," he said. "The land is just land." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are a very strange man, Mr. Bristol." "I've been told worse," he said. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a short, genuine sound surprised out of her. Lily looked up from the lizard investigation and said, "Mama, what's funny?" And Emma said, "Mr. Bristol is funny." And Lily studied him with great seriousness and said, "He looks serious," which made Emma laugh again, properly this time, and Reuben found that the sound of it did something entirely unreasonable to his ability to concentrate on wheel repair. They finished the job and he helped her hitch the wheel back on, and she thanked him, and he watched her drive the wagon back down the road south toward the Harlan Creek property. And he stood there in the May sunshine feeling like a man who has been moved significantly off his previous position, without being entirely sure how. June in Kansas was hot and busy, and he threw himself into work on the new property with considerable energy, which helped with everything except the evening hours when the day's work was done, and the plains lay golden and quiet around him, and his mind did what it wanted. He began dropping by the Harlan Creek property on Sundays, ostensibly because his route to church took him nearby. Emma did not call this out as the transparent fiction it probably was, but she did begin leaving coffee on the fire on Sunday mornings, and when he knocked at the door she would say she had extra and gesture for him to sit down at the rough table inside, and Lily would show him whatever she had found or made or decided was important that week, and they would talk about the land and the cattle market and the weather and the town. He helped her mend the corral fence one Sunday in June, when it became clear the post had rotted through. He helped her retrench the garden irrigation channel after a heavy rain washed it out. She helped him in return, riding out to his new property one afternoon with a wagon full of the jam she had put up from wild plums and a very firm opinion about where his cabin door ought to face for best light, which turned out to be an opinion that was completely correct and which saved him from a summer of working in a north-facing room. Willis Cord watched Reuben's growing preoccupation with the widow Harper with the knowing expression of a man who had seen this story before. "You're over there fixing fence every second Sunday," he observed one afternoon from behind a hammer. "The fence needed fixing," Reuben said. "I imagine it did," Willis said. "In the middle of July there was a community gathering at the church, a potluck supper that the town organized every summer, with tables set up outside and fiddle music afterward. Reuben had attended the previous years out of loneliness and a lack of other options, and he attended this one for reasons that had become considerably more specific. Emma brought a bean dish and a plum cake that Lily was very proud of, having stirred the batter herself. She introduced him to two women she had become friendly with in town, sisters named Martha and Clara Boone, who kept a proper farm east of Caldwell and who looked at Reuben with the unsubtle assessment of women taking stock of a man on behalf of a friend. "We've heard about you," Martha said pleasantly. "Good things?" Reuben asked. "Mostly," Clara said, which made Emma press her lips together in the way he had learned meant she was suppressing a smile. After supper, when the fiddles started and people began moving to the clearing that served as a dance floor on such occasions, Emma watched from the edge, holding a cup of lemonade. Lily had been taken in hand by Martha and Clara and was being taught to do a simple reel by several of the other children, with great enthusiasm and very little accuracy. Reuben came and stood beside Emma, and they watched the dancing for a while without speaking, which had become something they were good at, the comfortable silence between two people who had stopped needing to fill space with words. "Do you dance?" he asked. "I used to," she said. "Would you like to?" She looked at him. In the warm July evening light, with the fiddles playing and the sound of laughter around them, she looked at him with something open in her expression, something she had been keeping more carefully guarded through the spring and into summer. "Yes," she said, "I would." They danced 3 dances, which was enough for Martha and Clara to exchange meaningful looks across the clearing, and for the general store owner Garfield to say something to his wife that made her turn and look with interest. Reuben was not a graceful dancer, but he was steady and clear in the lead, and Emma was light and quick, and they found each other's rhythm without difficulty, as though they had been doing this for some time. Between the second and third dance she said, very simply and without looking at him, "I don't want you to think that I haven't thought about what you did at the hearing, because I have thought about it a great deal." "Emma," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name without thinking about it, and they both registered it at the same time. He did not apologize for it. "You don't owe me anything in return for that. I want you to be clear about that." She looked up at him then. "I am clear about what I owe you," she said quietly. "I am also clear about what I feel, and those two things are entirely separate." He was still looking at her. "I think you should know," she said, "that I am not a woman who lets sentiment lead her anywhere foolish. I have Lily to think about and a property to manage, and I am very practical about most things." She held his gaze steadily. "But I am also not a woman who lies to herself about what she feels, So I thought you should know that I look forward to Sunday mornings considerably more than I probably should." The fiddles struck up again. He took her hand for the third dance, and he held it a little more firmly than strictly necessary, and she let him. July gave way to August, which arrived with full force in Caldwell, blazing days and warm nights, and a dry wind that came across the prairie smelling of heat and dust. Reuben's cabin was finished by the first week of August, a solid two-room structure with a covered porch and a good stone chimney. Willis Cord stayed on to help build the barn, and Reuben had purchased 8 cattle and was planning his operation carefully for the fall. He and Emma had found their footing by then in something that neither of them had formally named, but both of them understood. He came on Sundays and stayed longer. She rode out on occasion to his property to see the progress, Lily asleep in the wagon bed on the way back. They had conversations that went deep in the way that conversations do when two people are paying genuine attention to each other. He learned that she had been born in 1856 in a farmhouse in western Missouri, the second of 5 children, and that she had been quietly stubborn about reading and education from an early age in a way that had driven her mother to distraction and her father to quiet pride. She had met her husband Thomas at church at the age of 19 and married him a year later and been genuinely happy in that marriage, which she spoke of honestly and without pretense. "I'm not going to pretend he didn't exist," she told Reuben one evening on her porch with the summer sky going purple and gold in the west. "He was a good man and I loved him and I miss him. Both of those things can be true while I am also here, right now, which is also real." "Of course they can," Reuben said. She looked at him. "Some men find that uncomfortable." "I am not most men," he said. "No," she said, watching him. "You are definitely not." He learned that she made decisions quickly and held to them firmly, that she had a dry sense of humor that emerged sideways when she was comfortable, that she was fiercer in her love for Lily than she was about almost anything else on earth, and that she had a habit of humming while she worked in the kitchen that she was not entirely aware of doing. She learned about him, too, about the ranch in West Texas where he had grown up, the youngest of 3 boys, with a father who was hard but fair, and a mother who was the center of everything. About the years of cattle drives that had been lonesome and educational in equal measure. About why he had saved for the land so carefully, which was because he had grown up watching his father work someone else's range and had made a private vow very young that he would own his own ground before 40. "You gave it away," she pointed out once. "I found more," he said. "You might not have," she said. He looked at her. "It would have been worth it regardless." She was quiet after that, but she reached across the porch railing and briefly touched the back of his hand, just once, just lightly, and he turned his hand over and held hers for a moment before they both let go and went back to watching the sunset. On a late August afternoon, there was a different kind of trouble. A man named Clifton Graves rode out to the Harlan Creek property with 2 companions and a great deal of bluster. Graves was a land speculator who had been circling Caldwell's South Range for some months, buying up parcels wherever he could for cheap, and reselling them at considerable profit to Eastern investors who wanted to believe they were becoming Western landowners. He had known about the Harper Bristol dispute and had apparently decided that Emma, as a widow without a man to back her up, was a suitable target for pressure. Reuben happened to be at the property that afternoon, helping Emma repair a section of roof where a storm had loosened several shingles. He was up on the roof when he heard the riders come in. Graves was a heavy-set man in an expensive hat who sat his horse with the ease of someone accustomed to using his physical presence as leverage. He told Emma, in a way that was framed as courtesy but was actually a kind of deliberate pressure, that he would like to buy the Harlan Creek property and that he was prepared to make a generous offer, and that she should consider that a woman alone managing 40 acres was a considerable challenge, and that his offer would allow her to set herself up very comfortably in town. Emma was standing in the yard, hands at her sides, looking up at him with perfect composure. "Thank you for the offer," she said. "The property is not for sale." "Mrs. Harper," Graves said, with the particular patience of a man who believes a woman's no is a negotiating position rather than an answer, "I would encourage you to think carefully. These 40 acres are not an easy operation for one person." "It is not for sale," Emma said again, with exactly the same tone, clear as a bell. "Now, see," Graves started, and one of the companions made the mistake of moving his horse a step forward toward Emma, and Reuben came down off the roof in about 4 strides that were rapid enough to get everyone's attention. He came around the corner of the cabin and stood beside Emma, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not make any dramatic gestures, but he was a man who had spent 10 years on cattle drives managing other men in difficult situations, and he had a particular way of being present that communicated clearly. "She said it is not for sale," Reuben said quietly. "That's her answer, and it is not going to change. I would suggest you gentlemen get back on the road." Graves looked at him with the recalibration of someone reassessing. He looked at Emma, and then back at Reuben, and then he pulled his horse around with an air of dignity that was mostly manufactured. "The offer stands," he said. "It will still be declined," Emma said pleasantly. The 3 of them rode out. Emma watched them go until they were well up the creek road, and then she let out a long, controlled breath and looked sideways at Reuben. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't do much," he said. "You came around the corner," she said. "That was sufficient." There was a brief pause, though I had it managed. "I know you did," he said. "You would have been fine." "Then why did you come down?" He looked at her. "Because I did not particularly enjoy watching someone try to pressure you." She held his gaze. The afternoon was very warm and very still. Somewhere in the cabin Lily was asleep for her afternoon nap, and the chickens were moving around the yard, and the creek could be heard just faintly beyond the cottonwoods. "Reuben," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name without qualification. He felt it the way you feel a door opening. "Emma," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that we have arrived somewhere, you and I, that probably wants to be said out loud." "I think we have," he agreed. "I am in love with you," she said, in the same direct, clear-eyed way she did most things, looking right at him. "I have been aware of that for some time, and I did not want to say it until I was certain it was not gratitude or loneliness or any other thing that could be mistaken for it. But it is not any of those things. It is very specifically you, and I am very specifically in love with you." The plains stretched away in every direction in the August heat. Reuben Bristol had ridden 1,000 miles of them, and never once in all that distance found something that felt like what was currently happening in his chest. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the day you stood on that porch with the rifle in the crook of your arm and told me I was on private property." She blinked. "That was the day we met." "It was," he said. "That's very quick," she said. "I know. I believe you anyway," she said. He reached out and took her hand, properly this time, not the brief touch on the porch railing, but deliberately and completely. And she let him hold it, and she turned her hand so her fingers were through his. And they stood there in the yard of the Harlan Creek property in the August afternoon, and looked at each other with the full and uncomplicated recognition of people who have been heading toward each other since the beginning of the story. He kissed her first on a Sunday morning in September, on the porch of her cabin, with the coffee cooling on the step, and Lily absorbed inside with the cloth doll that Martha Boone had given her. It was not an impetuous kiss. It was the kind of kiss that comes after 2 people have been honest with each other and know exactly what they are doing. She kissed him back in precisely the same spirit. The autumn of 1882 moved through Caldwell in the rich, amber-colored way that Kansas autumns do, with the grass going gold and the cottonwoods along the creek throwing yellow leaves into the clear water, and the sky taking on the particular deep blue of October. Reuben's ranch operation was beginning to take shape. He had 12 cattle now, a small but solid start, and the barn was finished and properly winterized. His cabin was becoming something more like a home in the hands of a man who was starting to think more carefully about what home ought to look like. He thought about it on the ride to the Harlan Creek property on Sundays. He thought about it in the evenings sitting on his own porch looking south, in the direction of 40 acres of creek land that now had flowers in a pot by the door and chickens in the yard, and a woman he loved working it with the kind of fierce, capable commitment that made everything she touched better. He proposed on a Wednesday in October, which he chose deliberately because Wednesday was when she came into town for supplies, and he could meet her at the general store, and it would feel like the ordinary course of things until it didn't. He was waiting outside the store when she drove up in the wagon, and she gave him the small smile that had become her greeting for him, and he helped her down, and then he stood there in the morning sunlight on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, with his hat in his hands, and he said what he had to say. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to be Lily's father and your husband, and I want to spend the rest of my life on adjacent land to yours, which I recognize is not the most poetic proposal in the history of such things, but I am not a particularly poetic man, and I thought honesty served better." Emma stood on the boardwalk looking at him with those green eyes. There was a slight wind moving through the street, lifting the dust. "Adjacent land," she said. "Or the same land," he said. "However you would prefer to arrange it. Your property is yours and it will stay yours. That was not a loan or a gift with conditions attached, and it never will be." "I know that," she said quietly. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "It is very definitely a yes," she said. He put his hat back on and she reached up and kissed him on the cheek right there on the main street of Caldwell, which the general store owner Garfield witnessed through his front window and told his wife about by noon, and which had become the established story of the Bristol proposal among the town's population by suppertime. They were married in November of 1882, on a Saturday with a cold, clear sky, and everyone from the Sunday congregation present, and Martha and Clara Boone in their best dresses and Willis Cord in a hat he had clearly borrowed from someone of larger head size. The preacher who conducted the ceremony was a kind man named Reverend Aldrich, who had buried many of this county's dead, and married many of its living, and who understood from long experience that a marriage was a serious and joyful thing simultaneously, and conducted himself accordingly. Lily wore a white ribbon in her hair and stood very seriously beside her mother through the ceremony, and at the end when Reuben kissed the bride Lily said quite audibly, "Now you are my papa," which caused several members of the congregation to require their handkerchiefs. Reuben went down on one knee on the church floor in front of the assembled congregation and looked at Lily at eye level. "Now I am your papa," he confirmed. She put her arms around his neck with the wholehearted confidence of a child who has decided a thing is true and done with any uncertainty about it, and he held her and looked over her head at Emma, who was smiling with everything she had, and Reverend Aldrich declared them a family, which they already were. The practical question of where to live was resolved in the way that practical things between two capable people usually are, through honest conversation and a willingness to compromise. They agreed that the Harlan Creek cabin was in better current condition and had the established garden and the creek water, and that Reuben's property could be run from a reasonable distance for the time being, with plans to build a larger shared home on a point of land that sat between the two properties once finances allowed. It was not a perfect arrangement, and they both said so freely, which made it easier to manage. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard, a cold that settled into the Kansas plains in January with brutal intention and did not let up until March. But the cabin at Harlan Creek was well built and properly banked with sod for insulation, and there was enough firewood and enough food laid in, and the cattle on both properties came through with only the losses that were expected and not more. Reuben and Emma had the particular domestic happiness of two people who had made careful and considered choices and found that those choices were right. They were not people who had fallen into something impulsive. they had chosen each other deliberately, with full knowledge of what they were choosing, and that gave their life together a quality of solidity that neither of them took for granted. He loved watching her manage the property, the brisk efficiency with which she moved through a morning's work, the way she could assess a situation and act on it faster than most men he had known. She loved watching him with the cattle, the calm patience he brought to animals and to hard physical work, the way he never wasted motion or energy. Lily grew taller and more confident and called him Papa without hesitation, and brought him things she found: rocks, feathers, a small turtle discovered near the creek in the spring, with the earnest certainty that these were things he would want to know about. He always did want to know about them. In the spring of 1883, Clifton Graves made one more attempt at the Harlan Creek property, this time through the legal avenue of filing a nuisance claim regarding the creek water rights. He claimed that the Harper, now Bristol operation was drawing more than its legal share of creek water in a dry season, which was a claim made of whole cloth and obvious opportunism. Reuben and Emma sat down together at the kitchen table with a map and the water rights documentation, and went through it point by point. And then Reuben went into Caldwell and retained a lawyer named Beaumont, a sharp-minded man from back east who had set up practice in Caldwell and who took considerable professional offense at the claim's transparent frivolity. The case was heard in March and dismissed by Judge Aldridge in less than 2 hours, with a formal note that the claim appeared without merit, and a pointed observation from the bench that pursuing frivolous claims against settled property owners was not a productive use of the court's time. Graves did not return after that. Word was he moved his operations north toward Wichita, which was large enough to offer more angles and fewer people who had already taken his measure. Reuben marked it off his list of concerns and put his mind back to the spring work. The larger house that they had planned took shape over the summer of 1883, built on the high point of land between the two properties as they had always intended. It was a proper frame house with 4 rooms and a large porch that faced south toward the creek, and a kitchen with real cabinetry and 2 windows that let in the morning light. Willis Cord helped again, bringing his nephew along for the heavier lifting, and the community of Caldwell provided the kind of communal Labor Day that still happened on the frontier, neighbors arriving with tools and food, and a willing pair of hands, raising the frame in a single long Saturday, and leaving it standing against the afternoon sky, while everyone ate around trestle tables set up in the grass. Martha and Clara Boone came and helped Emma hang curtains in the new windows when it was done, and Lily went from room to room measuring the size of her new bedroom by counting steps, announcing the result as 8 steps by 6 steps, which was, she declared, quite large enough. "For a turtle?" Reuben asked. She looked at him very seriously. "Gerald is very small," she said, which was the turtle's name, chosen by Lily with the same complete authority she brought to all naming decisions. They moved into the house in September of 1883, a year after the wedding, and it felt like the real beginning of the thing they were building, the settled and permanent version of it. Reuben's cattle operation had grown to 22 head by then, with a clear plan for the following spring. Emma had the kitchen garden producing well, and had added a proper henhouse for the chickens, and was experimenting with growing a small apple orchard along the south fence line, which the county extension agent she had written to said was achievable in the Kansas climate with the right variety. The apple orchard was 3 years off at a minimum, and she planned for it anyway, which was one of the things Reuben loved about her: the absolute confidence with which she invested in future things, the willingness to plant trees whose shade she would not sit in for years. In November of 1883, sitting in the kitchen of the new house with the smell of the first snow coming in through the window seams, Emma told him she was expecting. He looked at her across the kitchen table, and she looked back at him with that clear-eyed directness, and then he was around the table and she was standing, and he held her against him with the kind of careful and complete tenderness that a man feels when the world has given him more than he ever thought to ask for. "Are you happy?" she asked, her face against his shoulder. "I am beyond anything I know how to name," he said into her hair. She pulled back enough to look at him. "That is quite a thing for a quiet man to say." "You have been expanding my vocabulary for some time," he said. She laughed and pressed her face back into his shoulder, and outside the window the first snow of the 1883 winter began coming down over the Harlan Creek property and the Bristol Range beyond it, covering the grass and the apple tree seedlings and the repaired cabin and the new house equally, as though putting a white quilt over everything and tucking it in for the season. The baby was born in July of 1884, in the middle of a Kansas summer that was fierce and bright and smelled of sun-warmed grass. It was a boy, which Lily received as both important news and a significant logistical consideration, going very quiet for a moment when she was told and then asking 3 careful questions. Would he touch her things? Would he be loud? And could she choose his middle name? The answer to the first 2 was probably yes on both counts, and the answer to the third was yes, absolutely. They named him James Harlan Bristol, James for Reuben's father, and Harlan for the creek that ran through their land, for the old man who had sold Reuben the deed 2 years before everything else began, for the 40 acres that had been the beginning of the whole story. His middle name from Lily was Harlan, chosen after she had given the matter several days of serious thought, and announced her decision at breakfast with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. James Harlan Bristol was a loud and emphatic baby who slept poorly for the first 4 months and made up for it by being interested in absolutely everything from the moment he could hold his head up. Lily took to him eventually, with the grudging tolerance that becomes genuine affection so gradually. You do not notice the shift until the day you realize she has been reading to him for 20 minutes and neither of them wants to stop. Life on the Bristol Range through 1884 and into 1885 had the texture of good hard work and genuine satisfaction. The cattle operation was up to 30 head, and Reuben was beginning to plan seriously for a larger herd. 30 head was a modest operation, and he could see clearly how to build it to something more substantial over 5 to 7 years. He was careful and deliberate in the way he always was, planning ahead, saving margin, not overextending. Emma's kitchen garden had become something significant, producing enough not only for the household, but for regular trade with the general store in Caldwell, pickles and preserves and dried beans that Garfield stocked reliably because they sold reliably. She had also begun helping the Boone sisters with their bookkeeping on a rotating basis, which she found she was good at, and which brought in a small but steady additional income. The apple orchard had 12 young trees by the autumn of 1885, none of them producing yet but all of them growing, which she regarded as a source of very specific and patient satisfaction. There was an evening in October of 1885 that Reuben would remember for the rest of his life, not because anything remarkable happened, but because of the quality of it, the particular way it held every good thing at once. He was sitting on the south porch of the house after supper, with the evening coming on cool and golden across the Kansas plains, and he could hear Emma inside putting James down for the night, and Lily was beside him on the porch step drawing something in her sketchbook with a pencil, very serious about it. And the cattle were settled in the near pasture, and the apple trees were small dark shapes along the south fence, and the creek was murmuring somewhere beyond the cottonwoods. He had given up something in that hearing room in the spring of 1882. He had surrendered something that was his by law and by purchase, and by years of saving and planning. And he had not once, in all the time since, in all the difficult moments of building something new from the ground up, in all the cold January mornings and the dry summer weeks and the legal trouble with graves and the sleepless nights with a new baby, he had not once in any of that felt anything other than the solid, unhesitating certainty that he had done the right thing. He had never regretted it. Not once. The door opened behind him and Emma came out and sat beside him on the porch step, close enough that her shoulder was against his, and he felt her settle in the way a person settles when they have arrived at the right place. "He's down," she said. "Good," he said. She looked out at the evening and then down at Lily's drawing. "What are you drawing?" she asked. Lily held it up. It was a picture of a house with people in front of it, a tall person with a large hat, a slightly shorter person, a small person in a dress and a round shape that was apparently the baby. Above the house she had written in careful letters, "M.Y. Family." "That is very fine," Emma said. Lily considered it. "I'm going to add Gerald," she said, which was still the turtle, who had survived 2 winters in a box beside the stove, which was a remarkable achievement for a turtle. Reuben looked at the drawing, at the stick figure in the large hat that was unmistakably him. He thought about the boy who had grown up on a West Texas ranch planning to own his own ground before 40. He thought about the long cattle drives and the long evenings and the way loneliness had settled into him like a familiar weight he had stopped noticing. He thought about the morning he had ridden into Caldwell with a deed against his chest and found everything different from what he expected. Emma looked at him. She had learned to read his silences very well in 3 years, and she knew what this particular one was. "Are you thinking about the hearing?" she asked quietly. He turned his head and looked at her. In the October evening, with the last light going amber across her face, she was the most specific and irreplaceable thing he had ever seen. "I was thinking about how the best decision I ever made was to give away a piece of paper," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You didn't give away the paper," she said softly. "You gave away the land." "I got considerably better land in exchange," he said. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "You got land full of spring mud and a widow with a rifle and a 4-year-old who immediately started having opinions about your hat." "Yes," he said, "I did." She put her arm through his. The evening was deepening around them, the first stars appearing in the east, the plain going from gold to gray to the deep blue of a Kansas autumn night. Lily had added Gerald to the drawing, a small round shape with 4 legs that bore a general resemblance to a turtle. "Reuben," Emma said. "Emma," he said. "I love you," she said, simply and directly, the way she had the first time she said it in the yard with the August heat around them, and every time since, always with that particular clarity that was entirely her own. "I love you," he said, and leaned his head down against hers. They sat on the porch until the stars were fully out, and Lily had gone inside to show James the drawing, despite the fact that James was asleep and could not appreciate it. Eventually Emma went in to check on the children, and Reuben stayed on the porch a little longer, looking out at the dark shape of the land he had built, the cattle dim in the pasture, the cottonwoods dark along the creek, and somewhere south of that, just out of sight, the Harlan Creek property, 40 acres of good grazing land with creek access, and a repaired cabin, and a kitchen garden, and 12 young apple trees waiting for their time, belonging entirely and legally and permanently to Emma Harper Bristol. Because a cowboy had stood in a county registrar's office in the spring of 1882 and said she had earned it. He had been right. He had been completely, absolutely, categorically right. He never regretted it. Not for a single morning or evening in all the years that followed, and there were many years, and many mornings and evenings, and every one of them was better for the choice he had made. In the spring of 1886, the apple trees along the south fence showed blossoms for the first time, thin and tentative, pale pink against the new green of the prairie grass. And Emma stood looking at them in the April morning with James on her hip and Lily beside her, and called for Reuben to come and see. He came out of the barn in his work clothes, crossing the yard with the easy stride of a man entirely at home in his landscape, and he came and stood beside his wife and looked at the apple blossoms on the trees she had planted with the long view in mind, and the creek ran clear nearby, and the cattle moved in the pasture, and the sky over Kansas was the pure unbroken blue of a perfect spring morning. 2 more years before they fruit, she said. Give or take, he agreed. Worth waiting for, she said. Everything good is, he said. She looked at him sideways with the smile he knew as well as his own hands by now. He took her free hand and held it, and James reached across and grabbed Reuben's finger with the confident grip of a child who knows his father's hands. And Lily went ahead among the apple trees, pronouncing on the relative quality of each blossom, with the systematic authority of a person who intended to be thorough about this. They stood in the spring morning in the good land between the creek and the range, the four of them, and the apple blossoms opened slowly in the warming air, and the life they had built together lay around them in every direction, solid and real, and all of it earned by choices made with open hands and honest hearts. By the autumn of 1887, Reuben's cattle operation had grown to 48 head, which put him in the category of a proper working rancher rather than a man with an ambitious start. He had hired two hands by then, a steady young man from Texas named Pete Alderman, who knew cattle the way some people know music, and an older hand named Conrad who was quiet and reliable and could fix almost anything with wire and patience. The Bristol Range covered his original 60 acres, plus an additional 20 he had purchased from a neighbor who had decided to try his luck in Colorado, making his holdings 80 acres with good pasture and reliable water from a tributary of the Harlan Creek that ran along the eastern boundary. Emma's kitchen garden had by then developed into what could honestly be called a small commercial enterprise. She sold preserves and dried goods to 3 establishments in Caldwell, had a regular arrangement with the Railroad Hotel that had opened the previous year for fresh eggs and occasionally surplus vegetables, and kept meticulous books that showed a consistent and growing profit margin. The apple trees had produced their first real harvest in 1887, sparse but genuine, 23 apples from 12 trees, which she distributed among the household and the Boone sisters and Reverend Aldrich with the gravity of someone presenting something that had required considerable patience to achieve. 23 apples, Reuben said, eating one on the porch. This is only the beginning, she said. He had learned by then that when Emma Harper Bristol said something was the beginning, she was always right, so he ate his apple with appropriate respect. The second baby came in the spring of 1888, which was a year that felt charmed from January onward, mild enough to be kind, wet enough to be generous, the kind of year the plains occasionally granted as though offering an apology for the difficult ones. They had a second son, born in April with Reuben's dark eyes and Emma's stubborn chin, which combination Emma said predicted considerable things for his character. They named him William Thomas Bristol, William after Reuben's grandfather, and Thomas for Emma's husband, because Emma had said when they first talked about a second child that she would like the name Thomas to be carried forward if it was a boy, and Reuben had said, of course, without hesitation, because Thomas Harper had been a good man and had made Emma happy and had given the world Lily, and those things deserved to be remembered. Lily, who was now 10 years old and conducting herself with the seriousness of a person who had considered 10 years old carefully, and found it a significant milestone, received William Thomas with considerably more enthusiasm than she had initially brought to James. She had, over the intervening years, developed a theory that babies were more interesting as they got older, which she now had enough evidence to support. James, who was 3 and already deeply invested in the cattle operation in a way that mostly expressed itself as following Pete Alderman around the pasture asking questions at close range, seemed uncertain about William Thomas for approximately 2 days and then decided he was a satisfactory addition. "He is very small," James observed. "You were that small," Lily told him. James considered this information with visible skepticism. The summer of 1888 was full and busy and good in the particular way of a life that has found its proper shape. There were calves in the pasture and apples on the trees and preserves in the cellar and 4 children, 3 Bristol children plus Gerald the turtle, who had achieved a remarkable level of age and dignity in his box beside the kitchen stove, and a house on the high land between two properties that had become the most lived-in and real place Reuben Bristol had ever known. He had occasion sometimes, in the way of a man who spends time outdoors, to be alone on the range with his thoughts for long stretches. He would ride the fence line in the early morning or check the cattle in the late afternoon, and have the kind of solitary thinking hours that the prairie provides abundantly. And in those hours, he sometimes thought about the different shape his life might have taken. He thought about the deed in his breast pocket that morning in 1882, the plan he had carried for nearly a decade, the specific certainty with which he had arrived in Caldwell intending to lay his claim and begin building exactly what he had planned. He thought about what he would have built on those 40 acres alone. He thought about who he would have been, a man with land and cattle and a quiet evening and nobody to come home to, nobody to tell about the fence line, nobody who had opinions about hat size and apple orchard placement and turtle names. He thought about the moment in the registrar's office when he had looked at Emma Harper sitting still and straight across that table, accepting something painful with quiet dignity, and something in him had made a decision so clear and complete it had never once wavered. He had given up a piece of land and found an entire life. He had surrendered a 40-acre deed and gained everything on the horizon in every direction. He never regretted it. He never would. In the spring of 1889, Lily Bristol turned 11 and asked her mother to teach her bookkeeping, which Emma did with great thoroughness and quiet pride. In the summer, James turned 5 and was allowed to help Pete Alderman with the smaller tasks of cattle management, which he took to with an intensity that confirmed what everyone had suspected. In the autumn, William Thomas sat up and looked at the world with the dark eyes that were entirely his father's, and began forming opinions about it with the chin that was entirely his mother's. And on a clear October evening, Emma and Reuben sat on the south porch of the house between the two properties, with the children inside and the apple trees along the south fence, and the creek running beyond the cottonwoods and the land stretching out in every direction. Their land, both of it and all of it, the 80 Bristol acres and the 40 Harper acres, and the creek that ran between them. And they watched the stars come out one by one over the Kansas plain. Emma had her head on his shoulder. He had his arm around her. They had been married 7 years, which was the span of a life's real beginning, and every one of those years was present in the particular ease with which they sat together, the way two people sit who have stopped needing to prove anything to each other. "I have been thinking," Emma said, "about next spring's planting." "The apple orchard?" he asked. "Expanding it," she said. "Another 10 trees along the eastern fence. The soil tests well there." 10 more trees," he said. "They will not produce for 3 years," she said, "as you are about to point out." "I was not about to point that out," he said. "I know better." She laughed, that real laugh that had surprised him into something irrecoverable on the day they fixed the wheel spoke together in May of 1882, and he held her a little tighter and looked out at the land they had made together from the joined materials of a land deed and a homestead claim and a choice made in a county registrar's office. There was not a single thread left loose. The land was titled and settled and productive. The cattle were sound. The children were growing. The apple trees were bearing and would bear more. The house was warm and the creek was clear, and the plains went on in every direction under a sky of particular October stars. And every piece of it made sense, and all of it was right. And the cowboy who had once ridden into Caldwell with a deed against his chest, and a plan he had worked a decade for sat on the porch of his home, and could not imagine wanting a single different thing. He had been a man with a plan, and the plan had changed on a spring morning in 1882, changed in the best possible way, changed in the way that plans sometimes do when you let go of what you thought you needed and find out what you actually want. He pulled Emma closer. She made a small, comfortable sound and settled against him. 10 trees, he said. "At least," she said. "Plant them all," he said. She looked up at him, green eyes in the starlight, and smiled the smile that was his entirely, the one she gave only to him and had given since an August afternoon in a yard that was now their yard, all of it. "I intend to," she said. The stars moved overhead, slow and certain, the same stars that had lit the cattle drives and the long plains nights, and all the distance he had traveled to arrive here. They burned over the Harlan Creek property and the Bristol Range, and the new house on the high ground and the apple orchard along the south fence, and the creek running clear in the dark, and the two people on the porch who had built everything you could see from here out of honesty and work, and the particular courage of choosing well. Reuben Bristol held his wife under the October sky, and the children were asleep inside, and the land was all around them, and there was nothing left unresolved in the whole vast scope of everything they had made. He had no regrets. He had never had any. And sitting in the full and settled happiness of everything the choice had given him, he understood, in the clearest and most unhesitating way, that he never would.